Legislators in Zimbabwe this week passed the Patriotic Act Bill in Parliament. Under the bill, any citizen found to willfully damage the sovereignty and national interest of the country will be charged criminally. The bill comes after an explosive Al Jazeera investigative series called Gold Mafia, which was released and made damning findings against several Zimbabwe government officials, even those with close affiliation to the president of the country. The bill also comes 2 months before general elections are set to take place. We speak about this and other wide-ranging issues in the country. We're joined by journalist Hopewell Chin'ono. Hopewell, thank you very much for your time this morning. In essence, how should we understand this bill? Could this conversation constitute as a breach?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think what this bill seeks to do is to criminalize the rights that are afforded to Zimbabweans in their constitution. It says that it's working against those that willfully injure the sovereignty or national interest of Zimbabwe. But it's subject to interpretation. What is sovereign and what is national interest? We have seen the conflation of the state and the political party in Zimbabwe, where ZANU-PF sees itself as the state. If you expose corruption, as I did in 2020, I ended up in prison for doing so. But what they've done now is to go and craft a law because they've realized that there's no such law which can criminalize people from engaging. For instance, if I spoke to the South African ambassador in Zimbabwe about the problems that we are facing in Zimbabwe, and South Africa reacts in a certain way that is deemed to be against the national interest of Zimbabwe, I'll be thrown into prison for anything between 10, 20 years or even life imprisonment.
What has been the reaction?
The reaction has been revulsion across the country. It's only people that are benefiting from the looting of public funds and the plunder of the country's natural resources who are in ZANU-PF or surrogates of ZANU-PF who are celebrating this. The bill says that if I were to talk to anybody about something that is perceived to be of interest in Zimbabwe to the economy, and then the person that I've spoken to from another government acts and stops maybe, for instance, trade because I have said that this particular individual is involved in the looting of public funds, I will go to prison because according to this illegal bill, it's seen as if I've gone against the national interest of Zimbabwe. You see, the problem that we've had in Zimbabwe is that a lot of things that are done to benefit private individuals who are running the state are deemed as national interest. So, for instance, if someone goes to Belarus, does a deal which seeks to loot public funds from the state, and I expose that deal, they will turn around and say that I have done something that is against the national interest of the country. Therefore, I should go to jail for 10 years, 20 years, or even life imprisonment.
We understand that some traders are choosing to conduct business at night on some of the streets of Harare because of the economic situation in the country. And so how should we understand, especially when it comes to reporting for journalists in particular, where you bring truth to light, will it essentially impede the work that you do?
It makes it very difficult for journalists, especially the young ones who have been intimidated, seeing people like myself being thrown into prison 3 times inside 6 months for things at times that we didn't even do, using laws that do not exist, as the High Court ruled in my 3rd case when I was arrested for 3rd time on the 8th of January in 2021. Now, the problem that we face is that if I were to go onto the streets of Zimbabwe and report about what is going on the streets of Zimbabwe, and a foreign government responds by saying that what is happening in Zimbabwe is unacceptable on the basis of what I have reported, and they say they are going to impose a certain sanction on an individual or on the ruling party, ZANU-PF, I become liable as somebody who has done something that is against the sovereignty of the country or the national interest of the country. And the other big problem is that the law says if I'm in a meeting that discusses anything that has something to do with the sanctioning of the country, or even an individual targeted by a country, like what we have seen, one of the most corrupt entities in Zimbabwe called Sakunda is run by an individual called Kuda Tagwirei. He is sanctioned by the American government. If I were to discuss something with a foreign official of a government, or maybe as a journalist, and that ends up being used in the sanctioning of that individual, I, again, can go to prison and spend 10, 20 years or even life imprisonment according to the prescriptions that have been put in this bill.
The elections are upon us right now in August. And so what's happening with the voters' roll?
Well, the voters' roll is in a mess, as we all know that an election is a voters' roll. Right now, a lot of Zimbabweans cannot find their names at the polling stations. Voting in Zimbabwe is polling station based, so they've opened the voters' roll for people to go and check at their particular polling stations. And a lot of people, including contestants, former cabinet ministers from the opposition, have found that their names are not there. By law, the voters' roll should be available to the political parties, any political party, or to any citizen for that matter. I should be able to walk into a Zimbabwe Electoral Commission office, pay my $5, and get an auditable voters' roll. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which is run by the government and essentially ZANU-PF, has refused to release the full voters' roll because of the shenanigans that are taking place, where they are removing people's names or creating duplicates in preparation for rigging. So it's important for the international community to know that the election in Zimbabwe in 2023 is already contested, which means the result will also be contested because of what has been happening with the voters' roll.
And then you have election observers, which have been heavily criticized, even in previous elections in Zimbabwe. What do you perceive their role will be? Do you perceive there'll be any difference this year?
The role of the election observer is supposed to observe the election. And as we know, an election is not an event, it's a process. So ideally, election observers should have been in Zimbabwe 6 months before the election to monitor everything that has been happening. The opposition has been denied access to campaign for the past 6 months. And that seriously inhibits its movement around the mobilization of citizens for the election. ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party, has been allowed to go around mobilizing citizens using state resources, something that has been denied the opposition. So if we had election observers 6 months before, they will be able to note all these things. But the problem that we have with our elections in Zimbabwe is that election observers fly in on the eve of an election, stay in expensive hotels where they wine and dine, talking to journalists, and sometimes they go out, but what they see is not what would have happened during the preceding time before the election took place, maybe 6 months before, because there's been violence, there's been abuse. People are not even allowed to campaign unless they belong to the ruling party. The second biggest problem is that because of the nature of the unpopularity of the Emmerson Mnangagwa government, they are going to bring in observers that they perceive to be their friends, that are going to be favorable to a rigged result. They are not going to bring people that they think they are critical. So then again, it points towards a compromised election, because if you are going to bring in observers who are your friends, observers that you know will not say anything or see any evil, hear any evil, it means that the election process has been compromised.
Just last month, Zimbabwe received some helicopters from Russia, and it is said that the aircrafts will be deployed for policing, wildlife protection duties, and disaster management. When it comes to that specifically, are there fears that not only will they then be on the ground, but they'll be in the air as well?
Well, the problem is that, to start with, the helicopters that were brought in, the price was massively inflated. They said they cost about $10 million US each. And yet, at the very top end of that particular helicopter that was brought into Zimbabwe, is being sold for about $2 million, the top end of that particular make. So these helicopters have been brought in. It's another ploy to try and loot public funds. And again, these helicopters during this election obviously might be used to move ballot papers, ballot boxes, and things like that. So there's no transparency about what is going on. You see, ideally, in a country like Zimbabwe, where elections have been contested for the past 23 years, if you're going to have a free and fair election whose result is not contested, all the participating parties should gather, agree on the rules, and once the rules have been agreed on, then we can move on. And there is a standard that can then be used to say, no, we agreed that on this particular issue, this is how it's going to be handled, but you have done it the wrong way. But that is not happening. The ruling party is not engaging with anybody. SADC, unfortunately, that is supposed to be the mother body for the region, is not doing anything. There are SADC electoral processes and protocols that are well defined. The regulations and the rules are there. The constitution of Zimbabwe is there. It tells us what needs to be done, but all those things are being willfully violated by the Zimbabwean government, and SADC is doing nothing, and African Union has been doing nothing. And this becomes a big problem, not just for Zimbabwe, but for the region. South Africans should expect a lot of Zimbabweans to come their way after the election if the result is contested, because it means the economic situation in Zimbabwe will continue the way it has been because of the looting of public funds, the plan of the country's natural resources, and the failure to implement policies that work properly. You can't attract foreign exchange or foreign direct investment if you are running a government that changes policies like it's buying bread. And so it's important for especially South Africans to put pressure on their government to make sure that the government of Zimbabwe adheres to the rules and regulations of SADC electoral protocols, and also adheres to the Zimbabwean constitution. Our problem has not been about not having laws. Our problem has been about having laws that are not adhered to.
What of the campaign to free Job Sikhala? If you can just introduce him to our viewers for us. What was his crime?
So Job Sikhala has been in prison for 352 days today. Job Sikhala is a member of parliament belonging to the opposition CCC, Citizens for Coalition Change. And his crime has been that he is also a lawyer. He represented a family who lost their daughter through a violent crime. She was killed by a ZANU-PF thug. And when Job started talking on behalf of this family, he was thrown into prison and denied bail. He was denied bail because it's a political issue. The Constitution of Zimbabwe says that bail is a constitutional entitlement, but he was denied bail. He's a member of parliament. He cannot run away anywhere. He has been arrested previously 67 times without a single conviction. So it's pretty clear that this is political persecution, and it's meant to instill fear in the opposition that if you talk, we are going to throw you into prison. Because this government has got very little in terms of ideas that it can sell. It has destroyed the economy. It has destroyed public institutions. Zimbabwe's biggest hospital only has one maternity theater, as I've always said whilst talking to you, Dudu. And that remains the case. We don't have basic drugs like paracetamol in some of the central hospitals. Some of the key tourist resorts like Kariba don't even have an X-ray machine, which costs only 100,000 rand. But the government is failing to do this. So it knows that when it goes into elections, it will be very unpopular, and it did not want people like Job Sikhala, who are also wildly popular in Zimbabwe, to be part of this electoral process. So the last time when I spoke to him, when I went to see him in prison about 4 or 5 weeks ago, he said to me he's quite aware that they won't release him until after the elections. And this is why we turn again to SADC and say it should not be mum when such abuse of state institutions is taking place in a member country.
Hopewell, you keep safe. Thank you very much for your time this morning.